Inside Red Onion State Prison, Virginia. There is a prison in the mountains of Virginia designed not for rehabilitation, but for control. Built to house the state's most dangerous and disruptive inmates, Red Onion State Prison was engineered to isolate, restrict, and neutralize. For years, it represented the most extreme end of incarceration in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Its reputation spread far beyond Wise County. So did the controversy. Today, Red Onion is no longer officially classified as a supermax. But its legacy, and the stories inside its walls, remain among the most debated in American corrections. This is the fully factual story of Red Onion State Prison. Before we go further, if you value deeply researched, fully factual prison documentaries like this one, take a moment to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Beyond the Bars. Your support directly helps us continue sharing these stories accurately, responsibly, and without sensationalism. A prison born from crisis. Red Onion State Prison did not emerge in a vacuum. Its construction was a response to a nationwide correctional crisis that peaked during the late 1980s and 1990s, a period marked by prison overcrowding, rising inmate violence, and high-profile disturbances inside maximum security facilities. In Virginia, officials within the Virginia Department of Corrections faced a growing population of inmates classified as extremely violent, highly disruptive, affiliated with prison gangs, or repeatedly involved in assaults on staff and other prisoners. Existing facilities were not designed to contain inmates deemed unmanageable under traditional maximum security conditions. The solution, according to state leadership at the time, was segregation at an unprecedented scale. The supermax model. Red Onion was modeled after a new correctional philosophy gaining traction nationwide, the supermaximum security prison, commonly referred to as supermax. Supermax prisons emphasized single-cell housing, extreme restriction of movement, minimal human contact, highly controlled environments, long-term administrative segregation. The goal was not rehabilitation in the traditional sense. It was containment. This approach was already being implemented in facilities like ADX Florence in Colorado. Virginia followed suit. Location, isolation by design. Red Onion State Prison is located in Wise County, in the far southwestern corner of Virginia, one of the most remote regions in the state. The location was not accidental. At the time of planning, state officials publicly cited several reasons. Low population density. Availability of land. Economic need in the region. Distance from major urban centers. Wise County had suffered from decades of decline in the coal industry. The prison promised jobs, infrastructure investment, and long-term economic stability. Construction began in the mid-1990s. Opening and early purpose. It was designed as a Level 6 facility, the highest security classification within the Virginia Department of Corrections. At the time, Red Onion was explicitly described by state officials as a supermax prison. A designation later phased out in official terminology, but crucial to understanding its original function. From the beginning, Red Onion housed inmates transferred from other Virginia prisons due to repeated violent behavior, chronic rule violations, gang leadership roles, assaults on correctional staff. Many inmates were placed in long-term segregation upon arrival. Inside the walls. Red Onion was engineered for control. The prison's physical layout reflected its mission. Minimize movement, minimize interaction, minimize unpredictability. Cells were constructed almost entirely of concrete and steel. Each cell typically contained a solid door with a narrow viewing window, a steel bed platform, a combination sink toilet unit, limited natural light. For inmates housed in segregation units, confinement often lasted 23 hours per day. Out-of-cell time, when permitted, was typically restricted to individual recreation. Enclosed outdoor cages. Short, highly supervised movement. Contact with other inmates was deliberately limited. Technology and surveillance. Red Onion relied heavily on surveillance and electronic control systems. Correctional officers could open and close cell doors remotely. Monitor inmates via camera feeds. Control movement through sally ports and secure corridors. This reduced the need for direct physical contact, but also reinforced isolation. According to VDOC documentation, the facility was designed to safely manage inmates who pose a serious threat to the security of institutions. Who was sent to Red Onion? Contrary to some public perception, Red Onion was not limited to death row inmates. Instead, it functioned primarily as a long-term segregation facility for inmates already serving sentences elsewhere in Virginia. Transfers were typically based on behavior, not sentence length alone. Inmates sent to Red Onion often had histories involving multiple assaults, weapon possession, organized gang activity, leadership roles in prison disturbances. Some were serving life sentences. Others were not. Placement decisions were made through internal classification processes within the Virginia Department of Corrections. However, advocacy groups later argued that these processes lacked sufficient transparency, an issue that would become central to future controversy. Early warning signs. Within a few years of opening, Red Onion began attracting attention, not just for security, but for conditions of confinement. Reports from inmates, attorneys, and advocacy organizations raised concerns about prolonged solitary confinement, mental health deterioration, limited access to programming, minimal human interaction. These concerns were not unique to Red Onion. They mirrored national debates over supermax prisons throughout the United States. But Red Onion's remote location and restricted access made independent verification difficult. Much of what emerged came through court filings, civil rights complaints, investigative journalism. What was clear, even then, was that Red Onion was not an ordinary prison. It represented the outer boundary of incarceration policy in Virginia. By the early 2000s, Red Onion had become both a symbol of control and a focal point of growing controversy. Lawsuits were coming. Policy changes were looming. And the long-term psychological cost of extreme isolation was becoming harder to ignore. Solitary confinement as policy. From its earliest years, Red Onion relied heavily on long-term segregation, commonly referred to as solitary confinement. This was not incidental. It was central to the prison's design and purpose. Inmates placed in segregation were typically confined to their cells for 22 to 23 hours per day, with the remaining time allocated, if approved, for individual recreation or showers under close supervision. Meals were delivered through a slot in the door. Movement was tightly scheduled. Human contact was minimal and often limited to brief interactions with correctional staff. The Virginia Department of Corrections publicly maintained that segregation was used for safety and security, not punishment. But critics argued that, in practice, segregation at Red Onion was often indefinite. Duration and review. According to court records and VDOC policy documents, inmates in segregation were subject to periodic classification reviews. However, multiple lawsuits and investigative reports later alleged that reviews were often cursory. Criteria for release were unclear. Inmates received limited guidance on how to progress out of segregation. Some inmates reportedly spent years, and in certain cases more than a decade, in near-continuous isolation. Precise numbers vary by source and timeframe, and comprehensive public data on segregation duration at Red Onion has not always been available. What is documented is that the use of prolonged isolation became one of the facility's most controversial features. Mental health under extreme isolation. As Red Onion's population grew, so did concerns about the psychological impact of extreme isolation. By the early 2000s, a substantial body of academic research had already linked prolonged solitary confinement to mental health deterioration, including anxiety, depression, hallucinations, cognitive impairment, increased risk of self-harm. Advocacy organizations and legal experts argued that Red Onion was housing inmates with pre-existing mental illnesses in conditions that could exacerbate their symptoms. Mental health screening and criticism. The Virginia Department of Corrections stated that inmates with serious mental illness were not supposed to be housed in long-term segregation. However, civil rights lawsuits alleged that mental health screening was insufficient. Diagnosed inmates remained in segregation. Treatment access was limited by security restrictions. In some cases, symptoms of mental illness were reportedly interpreted as disciplinary issues rather than medical needs. VDOC has disputed parts of these claims, stating that mental health services were available and that staff followed established protocols. The full extent of compliance, and non-compliance, has been the subject of ongoing legal scrutiny. The lawsuits begin. By the mid-2000s, Red Onion had become a focal point in multiple civil rights lawsuits filed in federal court. Inmates, often represented by civil liberties organizations, alleged violations of the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Core claims included excessive use of solitary confinement, inadequate mental health care, arbitrary classification decisions, retaliation against inmates who filed grievances. Some lawsuits were dismissed or settled. Others led to court-ordered reviews and policy changes. Not all claims were upheld. But collectively, they increased scrutiny of Red Onion's operations. Judicial responses. Federal courts have historically granted prison administrators wide discretion in matters of security. As a result, many challenges faced high legal thresholds. However, judges increasingly acknowledged that indefinite solitary confinement, especially for mentally ill inmates, raised serious constitutional concerns. In several rulings involving Virginia prisons, courts emphasized the need for meaningful periodic reviews, clear criteria for segregation placement, adequate mental health evaluation and treatment. These rulings did not dismantle Red Onion, but they forced the state to respond. National attention and media coverage. As litigation continued, Red Onion began attracting national media attention. Major news organizations published investigations detailing inmate accounts of isolation, allegations of abuse and neglect, the psychological toll of long-term segregation. Because access to the prison was tightly controlled, much of the reporting relied on court testimony, medical expert declarations, interviews with former inmates and staff. VDOC repeatedly stated that Red Onion operated within constitutional boundaries and emphasized the dangerousness of the population housed there. The public narrative became polarized. To some, Red Onion was a necessary tool for managing extreme violence. To others, it represented a failure of modern corrections. Pressure for reform. By the early 2010s, pressure for reform intensified. This pressure came from multiple directions: courts, advocacy organizations, mental health professionals, and shifting public attitudes toward solitary confinement. At the same time, several states across the U.S. began re-evaluating their use of supermax prisons. Virginia was among them. The step-down program. In response, the Virginia Department of Corrections implemented what became known as the step-down program. The program was designed to reduce reliance on indefinite segregation, provide a structured path back to general population, incentivize behavioral improvement. Under step-down, inmates progressed through levels with increasing privileges, including more out-of-cell time, increased human interaction, access to programming. VDOC reported that the program led to reduced violence, Improved inmate behavior. Fewer long-term segregation placements. Critics acknowledged improvements but argued that isolation levels remained extreme, particularly in early stages of the program. A prison transformed. Red Onion State Prison was changing, at least on paper. The term supermax quietly disappeared from official language. Segregation numbers declined. New policies promised accountability and oversight. But inside the walls, questions remained. Were reforms reaching everyone? How much isolation still existed? And what was the human cost of the years that came before? The prison today. Today, Red Onion State Prison still operates as one of the most restrictive facilities in the Commonwealth. While no longer officially labeled a supermax, its core mission remains unchanged: to manage inmates considered too dangerous or disruptive for other institutions. According to the Virginia Department of Corrections, Red Onion now houses a smaller population than in its early years, and long-term solitary confinement has been significantly reduced compared to the 2000s. However, reduced does not mean eliminated. Many inmates still spend extensive time in high-security housing with limited social interaction, particularly during the early phases of the step-down program. What the data shows. VDOC data and independent reviews indicate measurable changes since reforms were implemented. Fewer inmates held in indefinite segregation. Increased use of structured behavioral programming. Documented reductions in serious disciplinary incidents. At the same time, civil rights organizations continue to report concerns involving mental health treatment access, the psychological effects of prolonged isolation, inconsistent application of step-down criteria. Both sets of claims are supported by verifiable documentation, underscoring the reality that Red Onion's transformation remains incomplete. Reform, in this context, has been gradual, not absolute. Red Onion's place in American prisons. Red Onion is no longer unique. Across the United States, supermax-style facilities have faced similar scrutiny, legal challenges, and reform efforts. What sets Red Onion apart is how clearly it reflects the broader national shift. From control at all costs toward structured containment and cautious, limited reintegration. It stands as a reminder that prison policy is rarely static, and that the consequences of past decisions can last for decades. Final reflection. Red Onion State Prison was built for the worst-case scenario. For years, it represented the outer edge of punishment in Virginia, where isolation replaced interaction, and control replaced rehabilitation. Reforms changed the structure. Lawsuits changed the language. Time changed the narrative. But the central question remains unresolved. How should a society confine those it fears most, without losing sight of their humanity? Red Onion does not offer an easy answer. If you found this documentary informative, like, subscribe, and support Beyond the Bars. Your support allows us to continue producing accurate, in-depth prison and crime documentaries, without exaggeration, and without shortcuts. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time, Beyond the Bars.